Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Federal judges are facing a surge in threats, from bomb scares and swatting to coordinated harassment. That's starting to influence courtroom decisions and make it harder to recruit new judges. Here with a warning about what that could mean for legal independence is founder of the Speak Up for Justice initiative, Paul Kiesel. Mr. Kiesel, thank you for joining me.
And good morning. Thank you so much.
We have done several stories on this show lately about the safety threats to public workers, and I want to talk about an organization that you particularly have stood up, Speak Up for Justice, that's focused on safety of the judiciary. Tell us a little bit about what motivated you to start this organization.
Well, the combination for me of I had represented the Austrian Jewish community back 25 years ago in the Holocaust reparations negotiations, where families who departed Austria and Germany in the early 30s left behind businesses and artwork and property, and this was an attempt to recover for them what they had lost decades ago. And I realized that our government and our system of justice was facing a similar crisis currently. And as the executive orders were being issued and law firms were bending a knee to the administration, whether it would be Paul Weiss or the Skadden Arps law firm, that someone needed to really organize speaking up. And there had been too much silence. And so that was the genesis of the Speak Up for Justice idea, is really getting out there and talking about what was happening to our justice system in America today. That's sort of the genesis of it. It turned into recognizing that there's vulnerabilities to our federal judicial officers and the risks they are facing and were facing and continue to face as they do their jobs, in this case, ruling on issues presented to them. And as members of Congress call for impeachment of judicial officers, federal district court judges who were issued rulings they disagreed with, rather than filing the course of appeals, which is the proper way to challenge a judge's decision, they were seeking impeachment, which was dialing up the rhetoric, which was exposing judges to significant safety risks. And so that kind of morphed together to recognize that Speak Up for Justice is the lawyers speaking up for the justice system on the one hand, and are speaking up to protect our judicial officers on the other.
Tell us about some of the threats that the judicial officers are facing. You mentioned the threat of impeachment, but there are safety threats here as well.
Well, sure. I mean, there's a member of Congress who last month put outside of his office a wanted sign, literally a wanted sign with judges' pictures on it, with judges whose rulings he disagreed with. And it didn't say wanted dead or alive, but the implication is that's what you're suggesting. And fortunately, that Congress member took the poster down. But that's the kind of rhetoric that started to really emerge where the judges' safeties were seriously compromised. And I'll point this out. One of our executive committee members is Federal District Court Judge Esther Salas. And for your listeners who don't know the history of Judge Salas, she's a federal district court judge in New Jersey who in the year 2020 had a disgruntled litigant who found her home address, went to her house. Judge Salas was in the basement of her home when her son answered the door. I believe he was 19 years old when he answered the door, and the individual shot him to death at his door and critically shot and wounded her husband, Mark. And that is the most overt threat you can have in America today. And that assassination occurred because the litigant didn't agree with Judge Salas's decision. Now, let's take that to 2025. When judges were issuing decisions that individuals didn't agree with, they started sending pizzas to the homes of these judges. And they were delivered in the name of Daniel Andrel, who is Judge Salas's murdered son. And they were then sending pizzas to the homes of the children, the adult children of these federal judges. It's saying, we know who you are, we know where you live, we know where your kids are, we know where they live, and if you don't kind of get in line, you run the risk of suffering the same fate that Judge Salas did with her son Daniel. That's about the most direct threat I can really address.
I'm speaking with Mr. Paul Kiesel. He's the founder of Kiesel Law and Speak Up for Justice. Historically, justices have remained pretty quiet about these kinds of threats so that they don't impact the litigation that's before them. How is that environment changing?
Great question. The answer is this. Last month, we had 5 sitting district court judges who actually spoke about direct threats, not about the cases they're working on, but about the threats that they received from litigants or just general citizens. And in fact, if individuals go to the Speak Up for Justice website, just type in Speak Up for Justice in your web browser, you'll find our site. And I have each of the prior webinars online there. So going back to April 15th, which was our very first webinar, to the one that we did just last month on September 23, they're all there. People can listen to them and be aware of what we've done. And the 5 federal judges addressed very specific threats that they received. And it's obvious, it's frightening.
You're also hearing from judicial systems internationally that this is a warning sign that other countries have seen before. Tell us more about how that works.
Sure. In the summer, we did a program with retired Justice Anthony Kennedy from the Supreme Court, and I had a federal judge from Venezuela, Javi Saldivia. And Venezuela in 1999 suffered a difficult election where Hugo Chavez became the president of Venezuela. Venezuela was the wealthiest country in South America at the time. And Hugo Chavez wanted to implement his own autocracy, and he replaced all of the Supreme Court justices with friendly judges. And those judges began to take down the judicial system by ruling in favor of the administration and not the constitutional framework. Sound familiar? And what happened was Judge Saldivia started ruling in favor of the Constitution and not what the president wanted. And so he got a call and said, hey, either you get on the program or you're going down. And he got a call from a security service agent saying, we have to get you out of the country, because if you don't leave now, you're going to be assassinated. And so he had to flee Venezuela and he came to the United States with political asylum, and he's now living in Los Angeles. But that was sort of the history of Venezuela. We had a judge from Poland, Judge Zabludowska. Poland has been very fragile in their judicial system, and it was about to fall apart when a group of judges from around Europe got together and they had the March of 1,000 Robes in support of the Polish justice system. And that march brought attention to what jeopardy the Polish justice system faced. And so I Judge Zabludowska. Our final judge was Judge Richard Goldstone, and Justice Goldstone was tapped by Nelson Mandela to start the Constitutional Court in South Africa after apartheid fell. So I had the international perspective on the rule of law and the risks of what happened when we lose the rule of law in a democracy.
It feels like an obvious question, but just connect those dots. What happens when we lose the rule of law?
Well, let's start with this. The rule of law is so critical to the United States' place in the global economic system. Businesses come to the U.S. because they know when they have disputes, they can have them resolved fairly and neutrally and impartially, whether it's by a jury or a judicial officer. There's a certain history in the United States of stability with our justice system. When we begin to lose the rule of law, we lose our place in the democratic institutions that can rely on the outcome of our judicial decisions. Stare decisis means judges following decisions from the past, which gives you a prediction of where things will go in the future. And our court recently has done a lot of damage to stare decisis, the following the historical precedent of court decision, not the least of which was they're now taking the Supreme Court the question of whether or not the administration can fire a federally appointed judicial officer by Congress, not controlled by the president. And they're now looking at a 90-year-old precedent that prevents the president from discharging an employee on his own and trying to decide whether that rule of law that's been around for nearly a century should stay in place. That's kind of the essence of the rule of law, Terry.
So at this point, you've mobilized law firms and lawyers and judges. What do you need groups like Congress and the courts and even the public to be doing right now?
Great question. Again, the court system is a guardrail in our democracy. It's a guardrail. You need guardrails because we have a cliff on one side and a cliff on the other side. And if you go off that cliff, you're in trouble. And so the court is supposed to be a guardrail, let's see, on the right-hand side of that cliff. Congress is supposed to be a guardrail on the left-hand side of the cliff. And at the moment, we're losing that guardrail. We don't have the congressional guardrail that we need. And so at a minimum, our democracy is at risk because we've lost the guardrails that have guided us for nearly 250 years. And so I need your listeners to mobilize, to not stay silent, to not be complicit. We need to really engage. What I'm really hoping we can do sometime in November, I'm a big fan of virtual work. It's made my life as a lawyer so much better and easier, and quality of life so much better. Just doing this today is amazing. I'm hoping we can do a virtual rally in November where we can get 1 million or more U.S. citizens to just take a moment of their time to dial in, call in, and be a part of a mobilization in America where we can. I realize in Israel, 500,000 Israelis marched last week in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, around the country, in support of ending the war. That's equivalent, population-wise, of over 30 million Americans taking to the street, given the population of Israel. I think it's important that we tell both our country and our world that we, the citizens of the United States, support our democracy and our rule of law and safety. And so I'm hoping, Terry, that we can really in November organize a massive virtual rally. I hope the largest virtual rally in U.S. history to make our point.
I've been speaking with Paul Kiesel. He's the founder of Kiesel Law and Speak Up for Justice. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.